Hello and welcome to the Road to Autonomy. The Road to Autonomy is brought to you in part by Stantec Generation AV. Stantec Generation AV combines some of the most experienced AV experts in the industry with the resources of a global engineering firm. Stantec Generation AV provides education, consulting, assessment, and guidance to any industry interested in autonomous vehicles. Learn more at stantec.com. Hello and welcome to the Road to Autonomy. I'm your host, Grayson Brulte. On today's episode, we're absolutely honored to have Robert Day, Director, Autonomous Vehicles ARM. Welcome to the podcast, Robert.
Thanks very much, Grayson.
You're very welcome. I'm excited you're here. ARM is an incredible company with an incredible architecture set that's known in cellular world, mobile world, but not autonomy world. So I'm excited for you to pull back the curtain and tell us about the great business that ARM has in autonomous vehicles today.
Of course. I'll try and give you a kind of good view of what we've been up to, around automotive and specifically autonomy today.
Fantastic, Robert. Over 125 billion devices around the world contain ARM-based chips. This is impressive. How was the company able to achieve this massive scale?
Well, that's the interesting thing about being ARM. Because we are an IP company and not a chip company, we really kind of rely on our silicon partners to take the ARM technology out to, customers and end users. And there's actually a little bit of an update here. We released last week that we've now shipped 190 billion. So you're right, it is greater than 125, but it's quite a lot greater. It's really all about the partnership approach. It's all about working with our silicon partners and giving them, the right technology to allow them to address the different markets that they want to put their silicon into. What we're seeing is as more intelligence goes into more things, having this sort of like standard architecture and standard software that runs on that architecture is becoming more and more critical. So if you think about how a car is kind of evolving outside of autonomy, we'll get to that in a bit, but the inside of a car that we drive today, it's beginning to look more and more like our phone or our tablet or our computer. And so there's this sort of synergy between the different things we want to see when we're in the car. It's the same as when we're in the home to a certain degree. You add in autonomy and all of a sudden you're not necessarily going to be driving the car. So you're going to want to have that level of either entertainment or work or whatever, which is really going to kind of bring this into a standardized. There was an interesting blog that our CTO, Dipesh Patel, wrote a few weeks ago. And he said the three key things that contributed to ARM's success were patience, focus, and vision. So since I've been at ARM, I've witnessed all of those. It's incredible the way this company really kind of does work and how it works with its partners.
ARM's an incredible company. I love the patience, the focus, and the vision. I'm reading this book about Brown Brothers. And Alexander Brown, the founder of Brown Brothers, which is a world-renowned investment bank, is stated that there was more money to be made with less exposure if you earn that money on the trade of others. But they were always focused on quality, and they had that vision. And that's very similar to ARM. So I'll give your leadership a lot of incredible accolades for studying history, because Brown Brothers built a great business. You're building a great business. And we went through this global pandemic, but somehow, I don't know how you did this, and I'd love to know, ARM shipped a record 7.3 billion. That's a B with a billion ARM-based chips. That's more than 900 chips per second and 70 million chips a day in Q4 2020. Supply chain crunches are all over the news. How is that possible? Is that due to your incredible partner network and your global relationships?
Yeah, it's a couple of things. It's one, fantastic partners that are out there shipping, but it's also the breadth of industries that ARM-based technology now goes into. Everything from IoT devices, smartphones we know about, cars, and now even supercomputers and data centers. It's really kind of accelerating. One of the nice things is we can take some of the technologies and the lessons we've learned in different industries and kind of pivot them over to a new one. So, if you think about it, well, we're in smartphones, which means we are kind of low power, but still now quite high performance because all the things you need in your smartphone. And we're in data centers and computer and supercomputers. Well, that kind of sounds a lot like what's required for autonomous vehicles. So I think we've got some really interesting technologies that we've developed that can now be applied to these new markets where autonomous vehicles, even though it's been around for a while, it's not in sort of mass deployment right now. And I think that's going to be a really interesting side of things.
Interesting is an understatement. You have powerful chips. I'm reading the reports around the M1 chips that run on ARM IP architecture. You're blowing the socks off this. If you're making the MacBook Pro run circles around every other computer, I can't wait to see the computing power that you bring to autonomous vehicles. I'd love to know, you got the partnership with Apple, you have it with Samsung, you have it with Qualcomm. Why are the world's most innovative companies choosing ARM? Is it the magic glue that's in your architecture set that these companies say, wait a second, ARM could do this better than anybody?
Yeah, so there's this element of having a kind of de facto standard architecture. As things get more complex, as I said before, the software gets more complex, and nobody wants to keep rewriting software for a new architecture. So it's like, we can take all of the software platforms and things that have already been kind of put out there, and we can kind of reuse bits of it. And also, this is an architecture that's very well known to a lot of the developers out there. So if you build a platform, let's say it's a smartphone, or if you build something like an infotainment system in a car, you've got a lot of developers that know how to write applications based on the ARM architecture. It's really kind of cool the way this technology partners, and we've got 1,000 technology partners who are designing, building chips in all manner of areas. They have this commonality. What's kind of interesting, if we kind of go and look at what this means for the car, is there are lots and lots of different processors in a car. Not just an autonomous vehicle, just a regular vehicle. And so what we've been doing at ARM is kind of building technology that can fit into different applications, even within a vehicle. So we have some of our processors that are kind of small and will do things like tire pressure monitoring or anti-lock braking or something like that. And we have real-time processors that will do some of the real-time actuation that you'd need to make sure things, work in real time. And then we have our application processors, which are powering things like the digital cockpit and the IVI and the infotainment systems. And now as we get to autonomy, that goes even further, because now you're going to need to have very high performance compute in order to run these kind of complex autonomous algorithms and go all the way through to then actuation of the car systems. We also have other technologies than just CPUs. So we do CPUs, we do GPUs, we do image signal processing. And all of that stuff's getting really relevant when it comes to, vision processing in a car and giving us lots of displays that we can look at, whether we're a driver or a passenger. So we have more than just CPU technology, which is probably what we're best known for. We have a ton of other things. And I think that's why, our partners like to work with us, is we're continuously innovating, bringing out new products, but also bringing out other things that will actually sort of supplement our core CPU technology.
I love how you said that ARM is constantly learning from multiple industries, because the car is full of industries. You can make the argument, you have the entertainment industry in your infotainment, you have this safety, you have various different elements of a car that tie into various elements that you have business lines. Putting this all together, when did ARM first enter the autonomous vehicle industry, and why?
Well, so if we look at what an autonomous vehicle looks like today, the majority of them are still prototypes out there on our roads, really trying to make sure that they can safely navigate, whatever operational design domain or ODD they're operating in. Most of these are based on existing car vehicles, as in vehicle platforms. So if you look at most of the robo-taxi companies at the moment, they're still running on, Chrysler minivans or whatever. And so we've been in the industry because we're in those things already. What's really interesting for us is looking at the mass deployment of autonomous vehicles. That's why we're really working with the autonomous industry right now. Is the prototypes, it's okay to have a trunk full of computer stuff, cables and everything everywhere. When you actually go to real deployment of true, driverless vehicles, you don't want a trunk full of computer stuff. What you need is high performance. But with this, I'm going to use this term swap C now, which comes from the avionics world. So it's basically reduction in size, weight, power, and cost, to make it deployable, but keeping that performance required for running the software algorithms.
It's funny, I'm sitting here laughing to myself quietly about the story about the trunk. A couple of years ago, maybe it was about 5 years ago, I was invited to a Mercedes-Benz R&D facility in Sunnyvale. And they opened the trunk, and it was, as you stated, full of compute power. Mm-hmm. And we were looking at this, and I said to the gentleman who was running the division at that time, I said, how is this going to happen? He said, no, Grayson, you don't understand. Our trunk space is one of our number one selling features for the S-Class 500. You got to get the golf clubs in there and the luggage. He said, I can't put this out no matter how good my autonomy is unless there's space in the trunk that individual customer can put their golf clubs in. This vehicle is not going to sell. It's funny when you dive into autonomy, it's all these little things that consumer habits they like that if it's going to self-drive, you better have that feature.
So what we're also seeing now is that although a lot of these prototypes are based on, regular vehicles, because you have all of the main drive systems are there and you're really focusing on the compute systems, we're now seeing people starting building things that are fit for purpose, as in they're not just a car with a steering wheel. They're going to be a vehicle which doesn't have a steering wheel, doesn't have pedals, doesn't need it. So why have those in there? It's not going to have a speedo because maybe as a passenger, you don't want to know how fast you're going. And it's really interesting to see that migration now as we get closer to deployment of actual real autonomous self-driving vehicles.
And as you mentioned, you can look at the Cruise Origin. They've developed a custom vehicle. Zoox has developed a custom vehicle. It's all built around the passenger experience. And as you look at enhancing passenger experience, your chips are going to play a vital role in that. If it's augmenting the glass or creating an infotainment, it just seems like there's so many verticals for ARM to grow in the autonomous vehicle space. When you pull back the curtain and understand your business, it's incredible.
Yeah, and this is where we come back to lessons learned from, being in smart TVs or being in tablets and cell phones and computers and stuff. I mean, that's exactly, and the software that runs on top of that's exactly where we can kind of pivot in there. Now, what's interesting is, the majority of people I speak to is really still focused on getting the autonomous bit to work. Okay, while, another part of the company is designing the interior and what will the passenger experience be like. And it's sort of fascinating having these sort of two different worries about computing and, how do these things work? But, it's really now all around, I need to make sure that my vehicle will do the right thing in the right situation with a very, very high percentage of the time. And this is where we kind of constantly look at the California disengagement report. I don't know if you've ever seen that. It shows, all the vehicles that are running autonomously, even with safety drivers, and seeing how many miles they go between each disengagement. And you can see every year they're getting better and better and better and better. So, I know some of that is because, they're running in relatively kind of fixed routes a lot of the time, but a lot of these companies are running on the streets. And so having to deal with us is a major challenge for these autonomous vehicles. Predicting what a pedestrian or what's going to happen with roadworks or, emergency vehicles. That's a lot of intelligence. And although they kind of train these things for these different situations, you can't train for everything. And so it's really interesting to watch how the intelligence in these vehicles is growing on a daily basis.
The intelligence is growing. The vehicles are becoming smarter. And there's edge cases that are in certain parts of the world where I live. Every Tuesday, the town sends around a truck with a big giant crane that picks up the palm leaves. So you put them on the road and it picks them up. And it has a follow truck. In California, you don't have that. So where I live, that's a unique edge case. So you say, okay, when the big crane goes to pick up the palm leaves, okay, we know we have to stop. And there's multiple communities around the world that have unique edge cases just to their communities. We talked about edge cases. You mentioned commercialization. You're having some companies are focused on commercialization. As these companies start to perfect their engineering, get ready for commercialization, are custom chip architectures currently being developed by ARM for autonomous vehicles?
So we're putting technology, and we'll get to this a little bit later. We're putting technology now, which is very specific to automotive use cases and towards autonomy, around things like functional safety for high performance compute. And it's really with the mindset of people actually going to deployment. Whether people will develop custom silicon to do it, I don't know. That's going to be an interesting, as they kind of get closer to deployment, it's, well, what's available out there? It costs a lot of money to develop a custom chip. So it's like, if our silicon partners have got the right SoCs out there, based on our technology, they'll probably just pick those up off the shelf. Now, there might be certain applications, there might be certain parts of the vehicle, maybe doing sensor intelligence, for example, where they might want to sort of do some of their own silicon. But at the moment, you have to get closer to the actual deployment before it's going to be obvious as to which way people go, I think.
What about the autonomous trucking side? They're heavier weight. They're going longer distances. Do you see some custom silicon being developed for that industry because it's a very unique, specific use case?
So what's interesting with the trucking ODD, you're right. It's high speed on highway. very much kind of looking ahead. So it's not necessarily going to worry about pedestrians in the same way a robotaxi does. So it really is the sensor configurations are going to be different. You're going to have a lot more long distance, front facing sensors in autonomous trucking. As far as requiring different compute, I'm not convinced they necessarily do. I think the algorithms may be different because it's looking for different things, but there's obviously similarities between that and, a robotaxi. And obviously there's things they don't have to worry about and there's things they do have to worry about. And I think the compute, you can probably still use the same type of compute. And in fact, some of the trucking companies also are doing robotaxis. So I think there's some definite synergy between those two different use cases, even though you're right. Now, what's interesting is I think also as autonomous functions or comfort functions come into our vehicles, things like, advanced ADAS level 2 plus level 3 features, which were going to be things like highway pilot and stuff like that. A lot of that technology will have similarities between what's going on in trucking, because it's going to be, you can't do this on city streets, but once you get on the highway where things are quite well bounded and you kind of, how to keep in your lanes, you know what to do. I think there'll be some similarities there as well, which might give us some interesting commonalities and volumes, because once we get these functions in our cars, there are a lot more cars sold than there are autonomous vehicles right now. And that's where the economies of scale kind of come in as far as silicon and what you want to build for what functions in a vehicle. So it's an interesting use case. And I think, like I say, there are definite similarities. I'm not convinced they necessarily need to have their own silicon right now, but.
Well, we don't know what the future is going to hold. You have companies that are extremely, extremely well funded. They might look at building their own silicon as a competitive advantage. It could possibly optimize the power usage or optimize the performance. And as they commercialize and start to generate meaningful revenue, I wouldn't be surprised to open the Financial Times or the Wall Street Journal one day and say Acme Company B or Acme Company A did it built on ARM silicon. I think that's a very bright future for you there. Putting this all into perspective, what are your thoughts on the current state of the autonomous vehicle market, both from a passenger side and from a trucking side?
So the nice thing is I think the hype is going down a little bit now, which is nice. I think people are being a lot more realistic about when this thing's really going to happen. But what is interesting, outside of some of the consolidation we've seen, which I think is actually a good thing for the market, because I think we're getting closer then to real deployability. But we're also closer to having true driverless vehicles on our streets. So in California now, I think there have been 7 companies that have been given a license to operate an autonomous vehicle without having to have a safety driver, on the streets of California. So people are starting to do it. Now, they're generally a specific part of a specific town or city in California, but it's actually showing that people are getting closer to being able to trust the technology rather than to have the sort of safety driver backup. And there are definite vehicles out there right now that are on the roads that don't have any room for a safety driver. I don't know if you've seen the adverts where Domino's is now doing autonomous delivery using the Nuro. Well, the Nuro's got no room for a driver. It's there for pizzas. It doesn't have windows because pizzas don't need to see out. It's a very interesting use case, and people are actually starting to get closer to actual, real driverless vehicles on our streets. I'm optimistic that people are being realistic, but I also think people are getting closer. And I think that's why the industry has started to do some consolidation. I think we're starting to see some sort of clear leaders in the industry now as well.
You're 110% correct that consolidation is healthy. We're going to see more consolidation healthy. And you brought up the most important issue. It's not engineering. It's not experience. It's trust. Will the public trust your vehicles? And that's, as an industry, we have to build the public awareness and we have to build the trust where it says, okay, I go to, hey, Mom, okay, I'm going to put you in the vehicle with no driver and it's going to bring you over for dinner tonight. Okay, well, my mom's cool. She's been in a self-driving car, so she gets it. But there's other individuals, moms or dads, that necessarily haven't been in the vehicle. And what are your thoughts on trust? Because I listened to a podcast that you did with another gentleman, and you talked about trust, and you had some really great thoughts on trust.
Yeah. So pre-pandemic, when I used to present in public, the first thing I do with the audience as a sort of a warm-up is say, okay, if I brought a self-driving vehicle here or to your home with no driver in there, would you get in it and go for a ride? Just to sort of get a feel for just the public, a lot of these people are in the automotive industry. It's not like they're just like random people. It's usually less than 25% of the people say they would. And it's like, oh, okay. So maybe pizzas are okay because they don't really get much choice in it, but people are kind of interesting. And there were some interesting stats done by a AAA survey of, so I think 63% of Americans don't want to share the road with an autonomous vehicle. So it's not us just getting in it. We kind of don't want them around us. But it really is an education thing. And I think the more we see these things like pizzas being delivered, you're going, oh, yeah, the technology sort of works for me. The trust will actually kind of go up with people actually getting into them. Because, the other thing is that some of the companies have actually been starting to do real self-driverless robo-taxi rides for people, in certain areas. I think Waymo's doing it in Phoenix, for example, and, other people are doing it around the Bay Area, people like AutoX. And so people have actually been kind of doing it to try and build, but you can't do it a person at a time. That's the trouble. You've got to do this sort of like on a bigger scale. And I don't know what that's going to take. The trouble is, for every positive thing, there's always a negative thing, like, autonomous vehicle does this, that, or the other. There was a recent one where it kind of got stuck in some construction zone. The other interesting part, which I've really started sort of thinking about, is if you're a passenger in an autonomous vehicle and it gets stuck, well, what do? There's no steering wheel. You can't drive it. I mean, you could get out and leave it there, but, that's not necessarily the best thing. So this whole remote piloting technology that's being developed right now is super interesting. So basically, the autonomous vehicle kind of gets stuck and it kind of phones home. You get somebody using sort of drone-like technology, and because it can sort of see through the eyes of the autonomous vehicle, steer it around whatever it's got confused about, and off it goes again back into autonomous mode. And in fact, there are certain vehicles that are actually kind of called sort of semi-autonomous. So things like the little delivery bots that run on the sidewalk. Well, when they're on the sidewalk, they're running in autonomous mode. They get to crossing a street and they actually hand back to a remote pilot to get them across the street. So it's kind of interesting how this kind of like technology that's come from a completely different place, which is drones, can actually be used to build some trust back. And also then the communication with the passengers in the autonomous vehicle. So it'd be nice if it stops, you get the drone pilot on, it goes, don't worry, I've got this. We're going to go off, we're going to get this all sorted, and then you can go on your merry way again. And so I think there's going to need to be that trust once people start using this service as well.
You bring up a lot of valid points for remote monitoring. Dr. Mark Rosekind showed me years ago the remote monitoring that Zoox did. And it was the most elegant solution that I've ever seen for if the vehicle gets stuck and all the safety parameters they put in place, but then also from the passenger standpoint, not to worry. And you mentioned building trust with the Nuro R2 delivering the Domino's pizza. I have a dear friend of mine that's in the restaurant industry, and he says, Grayson, this is all great, but if the pizza's not hot, and it's not like you got in a restaurant, it failed. And he said, you can engineer the best technology to bring it to your house, but if the food is not the right temperature, it fails, no matter how good the technology is. And to all my friends that work in this industry, I'm like, you got to figure out the packaging. It has to be crispy crust. The cheese can't be falling all the sides and cold. That's how you're going to build trust.
Having these commercial sort of enterprises taking this on, I think will help. Companies that we trust, which I assume Domino's is one of them, is kind of good. Well, Domino's trusts this autonomous vehicle to get to me. I think Walmart's been doing it. So, a lot of these kind of larger companies, once they start sort of advertising or showing that autonomy can work, can actually help build trust with sort of mainstream people.
Because it goes into my philosophy that brands matter, that brands are going to drive the consumer purchasing decision for an autonomous vehicle, if it's for a delivery service or if it's for a passenger experience. And Chipotle recently invested in Nuro as well. So getting your Chipotle delivered and a Nuro, okay, that's cool. I get my Chipotle burrito. And that is a company that has figured out packaging better than any fast casual company in the world. You have your burrito delivered and it is hot and it's really good. And congratulations to Nicole West and the whole team over Chipotle, because they're constantly innovating and they're doing good things. So you're in ARM. We talked a lot about brands and the public. I'd love to know, how do you go about actively engaging with the autonomous vehicle industry?
So you're right. It is an industry. There are well-known players that are building the autonomous technology. And there are a lot of people in the ecosystem that are building technology that will enable these autonomous companies. So our silicon partners being an obvious one, but there's a whole software ecosystem. There are, people doing functional safety. There's a whole world out there. And we have to work with all of them, because what we have to make sure is that any of the technologies will run on ARM and run on ARM well, will be available on ARM. What's really interesting is because the general automotive industry moves quite slowly, from one iteration of a car to another, it's quite a long time. The same goes for silicon, because you have to, do the auto qualification to build it. Well, we're an IP company, so we're even further up the chain as far as when we have to develop our technology as to when it goes into a vehicle. It's years. So what we've been doing is we've been working with all of the people in the autonomous industry to say, what do you guys need in order to make autonomy deployable? Okay, mass deployable. What do you need? I know what you're doing right now, but what will you need to make sure that you can safely deploy these autonomous vehicles, potentially without any sort of safety drivers, fit for purpose vehicles, all that sort of stuff. And that's the discussions we've been having for years right now, is what does this look like? What do we need to do as ARM? What do our silicon partners need to do working with us? And what does the rest of the ecosystem? And so, we've really been trying to kind of get a lot of these different companies sort of working together. We've worked with consortiums. We're actually one of the founding members of the Autonomous Vehicle Computing Consortium, the AVCC, which was formed a couple of years ago with, mainstream OEMs, tier ones, and other people in the industry, really trying to look at what compute is required, what do we need to do as an industry to make this for deployable autonomy. It was all around deployable autonomy. We've also been working closely with some other of the consortiums, the open source consortiums like AutoWare, for example. So we're quite active in the AutoWare space. And really, again, trying to make sure that autonomous applications run well on ARM and have all of the different, requirements for getting to deployment. That's what we're doing. That's why we're here. That's why we're working in this industry, because it's certainly not a volume industry right now compared to cell phones and smartphones and whatever else. So I think some of the things we've been doing, which we can touch on a little bit in a minute, are really going to help that goal of deployable autonomy.
Well, it might not be a volume industry today. It will be a volume industry in the future. Is autonomous vehicles considered a growth market for ARM?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, considering it's quite small right now, it's nothing but growth, really. It really is, because it kind of shows that this technology, it is evolving, it's growing, and I think that the mass deployment is still a way off. But it's visible. That's the beauty now. It's actually visible. It's not just something that... So from our perspective, it really is an industry and a market that we want to make sure that ARM is front and center. And that's why we've been doing all this work. There's a lot of compute that goes into an autonomous vehicle. There's lots of sensors. All of those sensors, could be ARM powered, all of the actuation in the vehicle, all of that stuff. All of these things could all be ARM powered if we make sure we have the right technology, which is what we've been doing. So, it might be there's not lots of vehicles, but there's lots of ARM technology in each vehicle, which is a good thing.
It's an incredible, great thing. It allows you to learn. You can study from the vehicles that are being driven today. You can understand energy consumption, which is going to be a huge role as we transition to electric vehicles and more compute power, LiDARs, radars, sonars, all the various different things, and not to mention the compute power that goes into an autonomous vehicle. I'd love to know, how is ARM engineering energy efficient chips?
That's kind of what we do. That's our DNA. I mean, honestly, low power, high performance technology, that's what powers all of our, our consumer computing right now. So it's in our DNA. And what we're doing is we're bringing that now into other areas. So for example, going into data centers, the ARM-based instances of data center are much more efficient, okay? Good performance, much more efficient, and hence the cost reduces. Doing the same in automotive. So taking that energy efficient processing and then wrapping functional safety into it, or wrapping different types of IP like GPUs and ISPs around it. That's what we live for day to day. And we can, again, really use that sort of common architecture, common technology to go into these different spaces like autonomous. And you're right, Energy efficiency, thermal efficiency, it's all going to be really important for deployment, especially in either vehicles that are fit for purpose or vehicles that we actually drive as higher levels of autonomy come into there.
And another critical role will be security. I love that ARM, from a corporation standpoint, you pride yourselves on security. Could you talk about that, please?
Yeah, so what we tend to do is we kind of have security at a foundational level. So making sure that all of the devices that are in a particular application, in this case an autonomous vehicle, have security right down at the foundation. And that's where we have our initiatives like Platform Security Architecture, or PSA, that we launched maybe 3 or 4 years ago, that's now starting to get into these different industries like IoT, making sure IoT nodes are secure, making sure different parts of the vehicle, especially when you connect them to the outside world. And what's going to happen in our vehicles is they're all going to be connected. What's going to happen with autonomous vehicles? They're all going to be connected. They're going to be talking to other vehicles. They're going to be talking to infrastructure. They're going to be talking to the cloud. They're going to be talking to remote pilots, whatever. And all of that stuff has to be secured. And so we see security as a sort of like a defense in depth. We're going to offer a lot of the platform security, but we also have to work with the security ecosystem to make sure that things like network security are built into these applications as well. So we really take security very seriously. From an autonomy perspective, you kind of hear these horror stories of criminals taking over autonomous vehicles and making them, drive over cliffs or whatever. Well, that's not so far from reality. Is once we connect these things to more of the infrastructure around them, security is going to need to be rock solid.
It's only going to become a bigger and bigger concern from the public, as we saw with the Colonial Pipeline. There's other incidents that you read about on a daily basis. So I think from a public perspective, security will become top of mind. I commend ARM for making it a priority, not an afterthought, because it's not only going to benefit your customers, your investors, it's going to benefit the general public. It's going to benefit our families, because your chip architecture will be safe to ensure that my mom can come over for dinner in a self-driving car. And I'm really thankful for that. And you mentioned functional safety a few times throughout this podcast.
Yeah.
Why is that such a critical element to enabling autonomy?
So functional safety is critical to the automotive industry generally. You can't make a car that isn't seen to be functionally safe, okay? Especially for us as drivers, we need to trust that when I do something, I press the brakes, that the brakes are actually going to work. So functional safety has been there a lot. As we get more and more technology coming into, ADAS and higher levels of autonomy, there's a lot of other things that revolve around functional safety. So, for example, if you have your automatic emergency braking, okay, well, that decision has to be functionally safe as well as applying the brakes, because now the car's doing it on your behalf rather than relying on you to press the brakes. So what's happening is this functional safety is moving further up the chain into the intelligence that's powering the car. If you go right through to, autonomous vehicles, well, there is no driver anymore. So this whole vehicle has to have a, functional safety, but also the compute subsystems that are either seeing what's going around or making the decisions based on what's going around and then actually moving the car. All of those things have to have a functional safety element to them, because as a traditional vehicle, you're assuming we as drivers are functionally safe. Because, we need to be focused, we need to make the right decisions, and then the car needs to just make sure that when we make them, it does it properly. Well, in an autonomous vehicle, it has to do everything better than a human in order to actually, safely integrate into our lives. So I think functional safety is a given. Now, what's interesting from our perspective is we've been bringing functional safety into areas it hasn't traditionally been. And that's into application processing. So the application processors are what powers your phone or your computer or data center or whatever. Well, they don't need functional safety, okay? But as soon as those application processors are powering the algorithms and the compute logic that is going to make the decisions for an autonomous vehicle, well, now we have to worry about functional safety. And so we've actually introduced some technology into our automotive version of our CPUs that has things like a dual claw lockstep. So you can run actually 2 CPUs running the same instructions to see if there's a failure. And then you kind of figure out, well, okay, if there's a failure, what do we do about it? Do you bring the autonomous vehicle into a reduced functionality mode? Do you stop? So you get this sort of failover or fail operational, if there's some problems. by doing it at the CPU level, it means you don't have to have full redundancy of all the compute systems in the car, which is the other option. So we're actually bringing it into the actual SoC itself through our partners to actually have this feature and this function, bringing in things like safety islands, which are, monitoring systems that will look at what's going on in the different parts of the vehicle compute to make sure everything's, operating in a safe manner. So, we've been putting a lot of effort around functional safety, both for traditional vehicles, as they get more processing and change their vehicle architectures, but, especially for autonomy.
You're making them more efficient. You're making them safer. Going back to this whole learning theme throughout this conversation, you're learning a lot from the smartphone industry through the application processes. You're doing really good. Does this all tie together to the ARM's Safety Ready for Functional Safety program? Is this like the glue that holds it all together?
Yeah. So functional safety was a program we introduced maybe a couple of 3 years ago. And it was really a bringing together a lot of the different technologies, a lot of the processes that we put in place to produce technology that will go into automotive or other industries that need functional safety. So yeah, it was really a collection of things, including some features like this lockstep. It was things like going through certifications for functional safety. It's having safety documentation to make it easier for both our silicon partners and the end users to actually show that this technology will operate in a safe manner and help them build their safety case. It was a much broader program than just, we're going to put some functionality in that will do functional safety. It was really trying to address as much of the safety needs that we could provide as ARM. Because again, given we're not actually building the chips, we still have to have functional safety documentation, functional safety features that people building the SoCs can then use, and then they will show that their SoC has functional safety.
ARM is primed for success. The track record's there. You have this incredible chip architecture. You're building in functional safety. There's no reason in the future that I can't see ARM running a majority of the vehicles that are autonomous on the road running ARM chips, because you fundamentally get it. So putting this all into context, what role do you see ARM playing in the autonomous vehicle industry as it matures, it goes through commercialization, it becomes a viable business? Do you see it constantly innovating with new chip architectures to make them more efficient? Or kind of where do you see ARM playing as the industry grows and matures?
So it's all about deployability and what's required for autonomous vehicles to be deployed. And obviously functional safety is one of those characteristics. It's obviously continuing to build high performance processing, but it's also giving the ability to, really look at the power and the thermals, all the things we spoke about before, helping bring the cost down. So all of the things that we put into our technology are all really trying to reduce this SWaP-C, as I said earlier. So, we're helping. When we design IP, we think about something called PPA, which is power, performance, and area. So, what's the performance of the chip? How much power does it take? And how much space does it take? I.e., how much can you get on an actual silicon die? We worry about that because you have to if you're in, smartphones and things like that. We worry about this for vehicles as well. We really worry about getting the right performance, which means that the software will run properly, but at the same time reducing all the other things that will make it deployable. We're going to keep doing that. We're going to keep working with the autonomous world to actually really kind of make sure we solidify that deployability. The other thing we're kind of really starting to look at is software. So within the autonomous vehicle, there are hundreds of millions of lines of code. Okay. Well, what does this mean? It means, no company can really write and manage all that stuff on their own. So we need to kind of help there. So bringing platform layers and things in, we've got some initiatives there. But there's also, understanding, what's the ecosystem as you go from development through prototyping into deployment? What are you going to need? You're going to need some commercial, you need functional safety, in the software side of things. And so that's what we're kind of really working towards is sort of like making sure that the software infrastructure is there to go alongside all this lovely silicon IP that we provide the technology for.
That's a really smart strategy. Really, really smart.
Yeah, it's very interesting because software is really becoming the key to this. If you look at a lot of the autonomous vehicle companies, they have a ton more software people than they do hardware people. because that's what they're doing. They're writing software. They're getting software algorithms working. They're going out there, they're prototyping, they're testing, they're simulating. It's sort of all software driven, and the hardware is just the kind of means to actually run that software. So it's kind of an interesting world for the automotive world, which has traditionally been quite a hardware-centric, world. The autonomous vehicles is they're more like software companies.
It's completely turned the industry upside down. The future is software. Mark Andreessen wrote the great Wall Street Journal opinion piece years ago that software is eating the world, and it's only becoming more and more true. We talked a little bit earlier about consolidation. Will that have any impact as the industry matures and consolidates on ARM's autonomous vehicle business?
No, I think what it's going to do is accelerate deployment. I think the more we see either a consolidation, as in, companies coming together, or things like acquisition of companies by larger companies, and we can think of some good examples there in autonomy, I think all that's going to do is going to drive towards deployment. I think when the autonomous industry started, everybody was out there kind of like doing this stuff independently. And I think now through consolidation, through partnerships, if you look at any of the autonomous tech companies, they have a ton of different partners they're working with, either their vehicle partners or their go-to-market partners or whatever. So I think we're starting to see with this consolidation, we're going to go to market. It's going to accelerate the time to market. And that's obviously good for everyone in the industry.
Partnerships are also very good for everyone in the industry. I always ask this question. I love to know, because I take a step back for a moment. When did you first become interested in autonomous vehicles?
So I'm a car guy, and I have to confess, I have 2 cars, and the only slightly autonomous feature that either of them have is one of them has hill start assist, because they're both manual. And so if you're in San Francisco and you've got a turbocharged engine sitting on a hill with keeping the clutch, it's not pretty. So I have hill start assist is my one ADAS function, if it's even ADAS. However, I love the thought of autonomy. I love the thought of the cars being able to drive like we as humans do, and in fact better. I guess my first thought around autonomy was with Knight Rider, so back in the 80s. And I was always fascinated by the car being able to take over when David Hasselhoff was whatever. It's like, okay, I'm going to take over now. And you're going, oh yeah, that's awesome. All of a sudden, the car can go faster, or it can drive better, or whatever. So I think that was my first exposure. We've really been working with the autonomous vehicles companies for, a good number of years now, personally. And I love it. I love going and looking in the trunk of the car and trying to figure out, what does what and how does it work. I love going for rides in autonomous vehicles. It's just great. As I say, I think it's a really, really interesting, application area. It's also really interesting thinking about all the challenges. So a couple of years ago, I was in Beijing, and I just landed in Beijing, and I was taking a taxi from the airport to the hotel, and we get into this massive traffic, and it's like, there's absolutely no way an autonomous vehicle could function here, because people were pushing in and pushing in and pushing in, and it's like the autonomous vehicle would just sit there because people would just keep gaming it and pushing in. So it's really interesting to hear that some of the autonomous vehicle companies are now kind of having more aggressive driving styles depending on where they're driving. I think some of the ones in Moscow, for example, are emulating Moscow taxi drivers, which is a little bit scary, but you can see that this is the subtleties of where these autonomous vehicles are actually going to drive. So as I say, I'm passionate about it.
I have a young daughter, and she was watching Disney Plus, and she likes to show Mickey and the Roadster Racers. And they had a self-driving car on Mickey and the Roadster Racers, and Pluto was in there, and Goofy was trying to build his own one. And of course, the Goofy moment, he's like, I'm going to make a bathtub drive itself. Okay, Goofy, you go do that. But it's amazing how it's getting into our culture, where you're watching a program on Disney, and Mickey races cars on this program, but it's a part of that. And you mentioned Knight Rider, and then at some point, there's going to be an Elvis impersonator in Vegas with a self-driving Elvis mobile serving banana and peanut butter sandwiches. It's going to come at some point. And popular culture is going to continue to define the future of mobility and the future of autonomy. And Robert, I've learned a lot during this podcast. I've found it absolutely interesting. The one thing that I love to know, why was ARM founded? What did the founders of ARM see that nobody else saw that allowed the company to go on to change the world?
So ARM, when it was founded, was a joint venture, and it was actually it came together to power one of the first PDAs, if you remember what a PDA was.
Personal Device Assistant.
But actually, I think it's Personal Digital Assistant. I actually had to look it up because I couldn't remember what the acronym stood for. I'm going, oh my gosh. So that sort of shaped, I think, where ARM started. It had to be efficient. It had to be performant for its day because it was doing new tasks. It was something that had to be kind of deployable out there in the market. And so I think that really kind of shaped certainly the start. And then obviously once we went into, cell phones and then smartphones and the increase in all that sort of stuff, that's sort of the history. So I think it was a very visionary thing at the time, because it's not like the whole world needed PDAs. I think that really kind of helped shape how ARM's view of the world is. It's like not afraid to go into these new areas, new industries, new markets, and autonomy is just one of those.
It's fascinating. The future for ARM, I can't wait to see what your scientists and engineers come up with next, because it's going to have a profound positive impact on the world. And Robert, as we look to wrap up this extremely insightful conversation, what would you like our listeners to take away with them?
I think we'll start with is autonomy is going to happen, and understanding it now is a good thing so that you're ready for when it does. For me, I can see it, I can kind of feel it, even though it's still a few years out for mass deployment. It's going to happen, it's going to be part of our lives. And really, I think, people getting to understand what makes it tick and why it's safe. And ADAS and autonomous is going to make our lives so much more safer on the roads. I think, again, it was the same AAA thing, maybe, said it was like 94% of the accidents are caused by some human something or other, either driving too fast or whatever. So it's like once we start removing us, much to my own desire to drive my car, I think it's going to really make everything safer. So I really want people to start, thinking about it. You're right, it's coming into pop culture. There's a lot of news about it, but really start trying to understand how this technology can kind of really shape people's lives. And we're going to be there as ARM right in the middle of it.
It's going to make our roads safer. No longer will you have an individual distracted, reading the newspaper on their phone, watching a movie on their phone, texting, because autonomous vehicles will not get distracted. Autonomous vehicles will not have emotions. They're not going to be in a rush to get to work. They're not going to be angry or upset about something. They're going to drive the way that they're meant to drive, and individuals will be able to get to and from their destination safely. Robert, we can go meet for dinner one day. I'm not going to have to worry about getting the clutch to balance on a hill, because the autonomous vehicle will have that figured out. And this is a really great future that's going to have a positive impact on every single member of society. And as we've heard on today's podcast, the future is bright, the future is autonomous, and the future is ARM. Robert, thank you so much for coming on the Road to Autonomy today.
Thank you, Grayson. Thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening to the Road to Autonomy podcast. If you've enjoyed listening, please rate, review, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Want to get in touch? Follow us on Twitter @RoadToAutonomy or email podcast@brulteco.com. The Road to Autonomy is produced by Brulte & Company. The views and opinions expressed on the Road to Autonomy podcast do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of Brulte & Company. The content discussed on this podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be taken as legal, tax, investment, or business advice.